Hi, my name is George DiMartino, and I'm the president of the Association for Social Economics. I want to provide brief context for Dani Rodrik's talk, which he gave at the opening ASSA Plenary at the annual economic meetings in Philadelphia in January. Dani Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He is a first-rate scholar and a leading public intellectual on matters concerning international economics, economic development, and public policy. The theme of the 2018 meetings was the democratic crisis and the responsibility of economics. The theme was meant to provoke conversations about what, if anything, our profession did or did not do over the past several decades that might have contributed to the illiberal turn in politics that has now occurred in Europe, the United States, and beyond. Is the economics profession at all culpable? And if so, why? How might things have evolved in a better direction had the profession acted differently? And what is the responsibility of economists today? For instance, how should economists respond to the deep cynicism about democratic governance and inclusion that now pervades so many communities, even communities where we might have taken the sustainability of democratic values for granted? What strategies should we advance now in order to support the values that are under direct threat, values like inclusion and opportunity, tolerance, and fairness? As soon as we settled on the theme of the democratic crisis for our meetings, I thought of Dani Rodrik as the ideal opening plenary speaker. Professor Rodrik was wrestling with questions surrounding economists' responsibilities far longer and more carefully than most others. His new book, Straight Talk on Trade, begins with this provocative passage. Are economists responsible for Donald Trump's shocking victory in the US presidential election? Economists might wish that they have the kind of power it takes to determine elections. But even if they may not have caused or stopped Trump, one thing is certain. Economists would have had a greater and much more positive impact on the public debate had they stuck closer to their discipline's teaching instead of siding with globalization's cheerleaders. The title of Professor Rodrik's plenary talk was, Is Economics Responsible for the Democratic Crisis? He opens by posing that question and then immediately poses a second. How did economists become part of the problem instead of part of the solution? He argues that economists stopped talking truth to power and instead became ideological strategists, looking to advance their preferred policies while concealing the downside of those policies, the significant harms those policies would cause. Rather than illuminating public policy debate with honest assessment based on economic science, leading economists became embroiled in politics in ways that undermine the profession's authority in the public domain. I'll let Professor Rodrik take it from here. Now, the blizzard that hit the East Coast at the beginning of the conference prevented Professor Rodrik from appearing in person, but he generously agreed to present virtually. The benefit of the storm is that it allowed us to capture the presentation and now share it with a larger audience online. We pick up the talk just 2 minutes in, where Professor Rodrik explores two paradoxes concerning economists' influence in the US and Europe.
Debate. And there, I think economists did not speak nearly with as much of a single voice as they did in the case of supporting globalization or hyperglobalization. In fact, there was division within economists, but there too, we were perceived in sort of rather partisan terms as playing into partisan arguments in politics. Rather than supplying impartial academic or scientific evidence. So there's really two paradoxes here. One is that if you look at these two areas, the globalization debate and the austerity debate, that we played a rather ineffective, at best, or damaging at worst role, both when we were united, and that's the case of the hyperglobalization debate, and also when we were deeply divided, as macroeconomists were in the austerity debate. So that's the first paradox. That the second one is that actually we could have made, that properly used, actually mainstream economics could have made a very positive contribution in both areas. I'll argue this in depth in the next few minutes with regard to the globalization debate, and I'm going to say, in fact, how if we had used the very sort of the seminar room or the classroom tools of the trade, of the discipline, that we would have been in a much better position to understand what was happening, to warn against some of the adverse consequences, and not at all be surprised by the kind of backlash that we've experienced. So that's really quite unfortunate. It's not that economics didn't have anything to say about these things. In fact, we had a lot to say, but somehow that did not get reflected in the role that we played in the public debate. So I'm going to argue that these problems are rooted in the way that economists understand their work and present themselves in the public domain. It has a lot has to do with sort of our implicit ideas about the kind of science we are, and that'll be part of my argument. So this is not the most natural kind of setting, so I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly, and I hope that also with the slides that my argument will not be as opaque as it might otherwise be. Right now, I feel like I'm just talking to myself. So let me start with the trade issue. So we know that free trade is one of these things that about which economists are actually quite unanimous or quite united. So this is from a survey a few years back from Chicago Booth School, where a number of leading economists have asked a question, a hypothetical question about the notion of freer trade. The question is, freer trade improves productive efficiency and offers consumers better choices, and in the long run, these gains are much larger than any effect on employment. So this is a sort of kind of an abstract question. It's not a question about a particular trade policy, a particular trade agreement. I'll come back to that later. But as, if you pose it in this kind of question, there is very strong agreement among economists that this is the case. So in this argument, that you see that that the number of the proportion of respondents who either strongly agree or agree is almost 90%, and that's typically in surveys of this kind. So, so this is, if you ask the question in an abstract term about, the benefits of free trade and whether you would support free trade. But what does economic theory or the theory of trade of the classroom or the seminar room actually say? There are three basic implications of trade theory, two of which are actually fairly well understood. The third is less well understood. The first is that that reducing barriers at the border generally enlarges the overall economic pie. Of course, there are some important caveats, second best issues, and things that we sweep under the rug when you say that, but that generally there are gains from trade. But the second implication is that, in fact, not everyone wins from freer trade. In fact, all of our existing models come with very significant distributional implications. And I'll elaborate on that in a second because it's important in light of what we're going through now. And third, and that's the one that's not actually well understood, I think, but it's a direct implication of the theory that we use in mainstream neoclassical economics, is that as trade barriers get smaller and smaller, that is that in the more advanced stages of globalization, that redistribution tends to loom larger compared to the gains from trade, that is the efficiency gains. This last point on which I'm going to dwell a bit is, I think, particularly important because it helps explain why trade agreements become politically more contentious as the kind of barriers that we're chipping away tend to get smaller. So I think this is an important point about how the political contentiousness of trade and hyperglobalization in the advanced stages of globalization, when barriers have become relatively small. The idea that we're getting a lot more redistribution relative to the standard gains from trade. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but already we see from the second implication about the distributive implication that economists that instinctively say that free trade is good are already in some sense are making a judgment about social states, because they're making some assumption about who's gaining and who's winning and who's losing, and whether that's a desirable thing or not. Maybe in the background they're assuming there's compensation, whatnot, but they're somehow willing to pass a judgment on a social state where that even in the context of their economic theories is unclear, because there are, yes, economic gains to trade, but there are winners and losers. How are we going to trade them off? It's not immediately obvious. To sort of say one state is better than the other requires a lot of complicated things. I'll come back to that as well, but let me just sort of first underscore the third implication, which is the relationship between redistribution and the net gains or the gains from trade. So with respect to redistribution, of course, we know that there's a fundamental theorem in trade called the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which is a very stark theorem that says, again, this is all in the slides, I'm going to go through this rather quickly, so I apologize if it's being somewhat telescopic. But in a very specialized model of basically two factors and two goods of production with full intersectoral mobility of factors, think about low-skilled workers versus high-skilled workers, then the implication of opening up to trade is that one of the two factors is made necessarily worse off with the opening to trade. So that's important. It's not a relative loss, it's an absolute loss of real incomes that accrues to one of the two groups. And in a country like the United States, which is abundant in skilled workers, then the losers are going to be the unskilled workers. Now you might say that, well, in fact, it is often said that this is a very specialized model, that there's no reason to believe that it would really apply, that the distribution implications need not be so stark. But in fact, there is a generalization of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which is actually fairly general. You can make it as many number of goods, as many number of factors, assume make different assumptions about mobility of factors across different sectors. But even with those sort of relatively general assumptions, there's still a very stark distributional implication that is stated here, which is that there's always going to be at least one factor of production that is rendered worse off by the liberalization of trade. There's always at least one factor, one group that's going to be rendered worse off by the liberalization of trade, as long as some of the trade competes directly with domestic competition, competes with domestic production. And this is called is a result of the sort of the magnification effect in trade theory. And again, there's a sketch of the proof on this slide. I'm not going to go through it. The main point I want to make is that these stark distribution implications are actually fairly general and are actually embedded in the very nature of trade theory that we teach. So how much redistribution do we actually get? And in particular, how much redistribution relative to efficiency gains? In some early work, I had developed the idea of this notion or this concept of a political cost-benefit ratio of globalization. So it's a very simple notion. Assume that all redistribution is a political cost, and the net gains or the gains from trade are the economic benefits. So this ratio is then the redistribution, is the ratio of total redistribution, the amount of money that is being reshuffled among different groups relative to the efficiency gains or the gains from trade that is generated by the removal of trade barriers. Forget that partial equilibrium. I'll talk both about partial and general equilibrium in a second. So the point is that this ratio rises as trade liberalization tackles progressively lower and lower barriers. And the reason for that, again, very intuitively, follows from sort of two things. One is that since an import barrier, an import tariff, or an import quota is essentially a tax, and the efficiency cost of a tax or an import tariff rises with the square of the tax rate. So there's a disproportionate gains to reducing high barriers. And when the barriers tend to get low, the gains tend to be relatively small. Whereas the redistributive effects are actually linear in the price changes generated by trade liberalization. So a 10% reduction in prices when tariffs are very low generates a lot more redistribution relative to the net gains than a 10% reduction in prices when tariffs were very, very high. This is somewhat abstract, but to make this a little bit more concrete, there's a couple of sort of very simple simulations about the nature of the redistribution we're talking about. So here's an exercise in partial equilibrium, which is, it just uses the partial equilibrium import demand, import supply schedules, and calculates this ratio of redistribution redistribution between consumers and producers in this case, of an importable good relative to the triangle of efficiency gains that are generated. It turns out that in partial equilibrium, this depends on three parameters: the share of imports in domestic consumption, the price elasticity of import demand, and the size of trade barriers. But what you want to look at is sort of what happens in that last column on that table, the redistribution per dollar of aggregate gain, as tariffs go from an average of 40% to 10%. That basically the amount of redistribution per dollar of aggregate gain rises from 5 to 20. What does 20 mean? It means 20 means that essentially $20 of income is being reshuffled per $1 of efficiency gain, per $1 of gains from trade that the trade liberalization is being generated. Now, when the redistributive effects are so large, it's easy to see that even compensation is not going to take care of the problem as long as compensation comes with some excess burden of transfers and taxation, because the excess burden is going to eat up more than the net gains from trade that is being generated if you really want to compensate all the losers. This is, again, very standard, comes from the textbook models that we use. You can do the same in a kind of more of a general equilibrium framework, and here is a sort of a kind of a Stolper-Samuelson setup where you have two factors, low skill and high skill workers, and you can do the same kind of thing, and again go to the bottom line. If you look at, for example, when initial tariff being removed is 10%, then the absolute value of the change in low skill wages relative to the increase in real income of the economy is about 1 to 20. So very large amounts of redistribution taking place per dollar of efficiency gain. So this is again, the point here is that these are our standard models are generating these huge distributional effects that need to be taken care of. Now, we have now a number of studies that in fact suggest that these hypothetical or theoretical simulations are not without sort of their real world counterparts. That we know that there are studies of NAFTA or more better known studies of China's entry into WTO, where the amount of redistribution or the amount of distributive burden that has been imposed on blue-collar workers in particular regions in the United States are very large relative to the efficiency gains. For example, in the case of NAFTA, most of our sort of state-of-the-art computable models of general equilibrium models of trade suggest that the estimated aggregate net gains are somewhere between 0 and 0.1% of GDP, very small for the United States. But we have estimates from labor market studies that particular groups of especially adversely affected labor groups have lost more than 10 percentage points in terms of wage gains relative to other groups in the economy. On account of liberalization with NAFTA. Again, sort of outsized distributional effects relative to the net gains. Well, what about compensation? Now, one of the things that the Europeans have done extremely well is precisely try to compensate for the distribution effects of trade, but they've done it differently than the United States, and they're by erecting very generous welfare states and very generous social insurance programs that take the edge of these distributive effects. And in fact, we see that the most open economy, or the economies that are the most exposed to trade, are also actually the ones in Europe and elsewhere that have the most generous social insurance programs. And that's why I often say that the open economy and the welfare states are two sides of the same coin. That what is enabled in Europe, the maintenance of very open economies with very high levels of exposure to trade, is the maintenance of very generous social safety nets. In the United States, we've tried to deal with this through trade adjustment assistance, which we now know actually doesn't work. And there are number of reasons why compensation hasn't worked in the United States, both because of political time consistency issues, but also because of problems of general difficulty of raising taxes at a time when capital becomes more mobile and the distributive burden of taxes fall on labor. So it sort of defeats the purpose to compensate labor by taxing labor. And for these distributive consequences of capital mobility are now very evident in the context of the corporate tax reform, or the tax reform in the United States currently. So in the United States, unlike in Europe, what we've had is increased exposure to trade, particularly to sort of low-income countries like Mexico and China, at the same time when, in fact, our safety nets, if anything, were becoming weaker. Again, all of this is in the standard economics, political economy literature. None of this is a surprise. Now, we could have taken a step, moving a little bit further from the standard economics or political economy models in the literature, and just think a little bit about some of the broader distributive fairness questions of that globalization raises as well. In that it's not many of the problems that globalization raises is not just about winners and losers in income terms. It's also that globalization forces competition among different jurisdictions with very different rules, different institutions. And often it forces competition under ground rules that have been prohibited at home. So things like unfair labor practices abroad, the presence of tax havens, direct or indirect subsidization of goods by other governments, essentially create problems of sort of fair exchange, fair trade. Now, domestically, we deal with these things because we have one set of ground rules that you cannot compete with another firm by hiring workers under a different set of labor standards than your competitor has to operate by. But in the global economy, of course, there are different jurisdictions, and therefore there's a kind of jurisdictional or regulatory arbitrage that leads to a certain kind of undermining of domestic regulatory practices and domestic social bargains, whether that is in terms of tax rules. So you say that we need to bring our corporate taxes down, otherwise we'll lose capital. So in other words, there's a downward sort of race to the bottom in corporate taxes through corporate tax competition. There's regulatory arbitrage that we need to make our regulations more business friendly, otherwise businesses are going to leave. And in terms of norms of redistribution, firms have an ability to essentially threaten their workers to accept less advantageous deals because they have this ability to outsource and offshore to environments where labor where wages are low, not necessarily just because labor productivity is low, but because labor rights may not be protected nearly to the same extent. So I think there are legitimate concerns about level playing fields and fairness of trade that economists might have been aware of, or should have been really aware of, because it's just a tiny step to take from the kind of standard thinking about economics. The other thing that I think economists should really miss the boat on, and they should have been really very aware of, is that so far I've been talking about globalization as if it was simply lowering barriers to trade and removing import tariffs, removing import quotas. But of course, globalization, or more what I call hyperglobalization, really after the 1990s, has taken a very different turns. That when we sign trade agreements these days, it's really, much of it is really not about free trade per se. That post the World Trade Organization, post 1994-95, that increasingly trade agreements have been not about reducing barriers at the border, but more and more about harmonizing regulations or reducing so-called regulatory barriers to trade. So this, my colleague Robert Lawrence has called this a movement from shallow to deep integration, where shallow integration is you're just lowering barriers to trade at the border, but deep integration is when you're really going after so-called barriers to doing business in other countries, and that might have to do a lot of impinge on a lot of regulatory arrangements at home. So where do we see this? We see this in things like so-called TRIPS, that's intellectual property rights, in patents and copyrights, international agreements that impose on a lot of countries the more demanding standards of the advanced countries. We see it in so-called ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, which essentially create, through trade agreements, special regulatory, special investor tribunals that privilege foreign capital, foreign corporations, give them legal rights, give them mechanism to reverse domestic policies in the countries they operate if those policies affect their profits adversely. And these are regulatory, or these are legal rights that are given to corporations alone, because they alone have the right to sue their host governments for changes, for regulations that they claim affect they reduce their profits. Furthermore, in terms of financial services and capital account management, a lot of trade agreements have brought in sort of restrictions on what countries can do in order to manage their capital accounts, and in fact, the soundness of their financial system. So these agreements have been impinging on a lot of areas which were traditionally thought of to be the domain of domestic economic policy and reflecting sort of broad considerations of economic stability, social concerns, and sort of social bargains. And so what that has made is that increasingly sort of, even when they're not dealing with barriers, trade barriers per se, these agreements have become essentially redistributive agreements in a different kind of a guise, because they now increasingly entail clashes in values in terms of different groups with regard to, for example, safeguarding regulatory autonomy and diversity versus lowering barriers as much as can be done to maximize trade and investment. And those are obviously two very different kinds of objectives. And yet the fact that sort of, despite the fact that the trade agreements are really now very complicated regulatory arrangements that go much beyond simply the sort of traditional free trade. If you were to ask economists specifically, let's say their view about NAFTA. So here's sort of the second half of that survey. Remember that the survey I showed you earlier was about sort of, free trade in general. And there was very large, 90% sort of support for free trade. This question asked to the same economists is really about a specific trade agreement, about NAFTA. So what's their view about NAFTA? Now, NAFTA is thousands of pages long. Has all kinds of clauses on these regulations and so forth. Yet it's surprising how the response of the economists is virtually identical. So it's as if NAFTA was just free trade, that it didn't entail all these restrictions and regulatory arrangements, conformity assessments and about regulations and all of that. But somehow, it was enough that this was called, a trade agreement or a free trade agreement that just economists instinctively say, oh, it must be a good thing, and therefore we must be in favor of it. So why does that happen? I think in the first instance, I think there's a kind of a naive political economy to which sort of a kind of hand-waving political economy. This is not the political economy that economists do in terms of formal models and the seminar room, but this is much more kind of a naive, a hand-waving kind of political economy that says, that the notion of comparative advantage and gains from trade are so important, so that they are the profession's crown jewels, that this requires a certain kind of vigilance, and that you don't want to provide ammunition against the barbarians, the protectionists, those who are against free trade, which always has seemed to me to be a kind of a weird argument, because you would think if there's a right or the wrong, and that there are barbarians on one side of the issue, that there would be barbarians on the other side of the issue as well. Why assume the distribution of barbarians is skewed necessarily in the anti-trade direction? We have a lot of pro-trade barbarians. I mean, there are a lot of corporations that want to sort of have market access to other countries by removing regulations that might be quite important to those countries. And those are barbarians on the other side. And so why assume that that one type of barbarian is more dangerous or more harmful than the other? And certainly after the 1990s, I think what I call the pro-trade or the investment protectionists, the corporations, the multinationals, the pharmaceutical companies that were pushing for stringent intellectual property rights protections, were the dominant voice. And in fact, sort of dominant special interest shaping these trader agreements weren't labor unions. They weren't sort of protectionist interests. They were these pro-trade and pro-investment groups, but we cannot say that the kind of arrangements and regulations that they were looking to get were necessarily unambiguously beneficial. The second one, on which I want to say a little bit more, because I've written a little book on this, has to do with a kind of misunderstanding of the scientific methodology of economics. That there is a tendency when economists talk about issues of policy to retreat to kind of a textbook benchmark models, rather than to take into account that in fact the strength of economics is the diversity of its models, and what we need to be able to really do in a policy setting or in a public setting is to figure out which one of the model actually applies better. So rather than retreating to the textbook model where distributional effects are taken care of through compensation and there are no second best complications and market failures whatsoever, rather than say that we have 4 or 5 different possibilities and what we need to think about which one of those apply. And that, I think, would have been a much more positive way of thinking about it. So I exemplify this kind of failing in terms of how sort of the economics of the seminar room gets perverted when taken to the public with a thought experiment in my Globalization Paradox book. And in the thought experiment, there's a journalist that goes into a professor's trade economist office and asks him, is free trade good for our economy? And the professor immediately says yes. But then sort of in the seminar room, there's an advanced trade theory seminar, and a graduate student, a doctoral student asks the same professor the question, is free trade good for our economy? Now, in the seminar room, in a doctoral seminar, then the question, the trade economist is not going to answer nearly as quickly, because what do we mean by good? Good for whom? Under certain conditions, and assuming we can tax the beneficiaries and compensate the losers. Free trade has the potential to increase everyone's well-being, but then there are also all kinds of conditions and caveats, and we need to guard about second-best interactions. So the details don't really matter. So that's why they're in really tiny font, and so I haven't. You're not supposed to read it. But the point is that the professor would actually take pride in showing to his graduate students, in fact, the detail that is required, the nuance that's required, and all the caveats, and the T's that need to be crossed and the I's that need to be dotted before we can say something about what the consequences of free trade is. And in fact, that's all about the level, the static effects. If you want to talk about the sort of the dynamic effects of trade, you'd have to talk about a long list of additional conditions, which I summarized again in small type here. So a complete dichotomy between sort of the readiness to accept free trade as a good thing in public, versus the careful nuance and the caveats and the specialized modeling and the contextual understanding of the consequences of free trade of the seminar room or the journal article. So I think I'm running out of time here, and I just don't want to take much longer. So I just want to underscore here sort of this that this is in part a consequence of the idea that consequence of the notion economists have of their science that economics is has to be about the right model, and then when you're asked, then you retreat to the one kind of model that you cherish the most, which is the textbook model, which is the Econ 101 model. And there's not nearly enough about understanding that, in fact, that what makes economics really useful and practical is that it's really it's a collection of models, that we actually have understanding of what are the conditions under which a certain kind of result obtains. And as Keynes once wrote, economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of picking the model that is relevant. So it's a combination of that science and the art. And instead of thinking of economics in that way, I think too many economists think about economics as basically a succession of getting better and better models, and ultimately the target is to get at the right model. But social reality, of course, doesn't admit that, because social reality is highly variable and malleable, changes over time, over geography, and so on. And that's not actually a very helpful way of thinking about what our contribution is. That's the point, an argument that's made in my 2015 book on economics rules. And of course, the problem is that we're very good at making models, but we're very poor at navigating among them. This part, that the art or the craft part, using Keynes's term. And that's partly because, of course, we don't think about what we do in terms of this diversity and choosing among them. Instead, we think about getting at the right model. So I think what happens is that too often we mistake a model for the model, and show kind of categorical preference for certain axioms, and have this kind of implicit political economy, what I called earlier this naive political economy theorizing in policy discussions that I talked about briefly in terms of this idea of protectionist barbarians on one side of the problem, and our too readiness to jump into evaluating different social states without necessarily being having the tools to make those social welfare comparisons. So to come to the end, just to say a couple of words about the austerity debate I mentioned at the beginning. So we see many of these similar kinds of failures. So even though here, it wasn't that economists had fixated on one particular model, but the debate in austerity was famed in terms of sort of getting, the idea that there had to be one right model, and if this right model had been the right one in the 1990s, that it had to also be the right one in 2008 or 2009. So the whole debate was whether the world is is the right model, the Keynesian model, the classical model. How do we think about forward-looking expectations, the role of credit market imperfections? So economists were very deeply divided about these questions, but the debate in public was really not about which of these models applies at the moment. It was always about which is the right universal model that applies all the time. And I think that made the debate much more doctrinaire, and rather than one that's actually would have been a much more empirical one about trying to sort of say, well, if the Keynesian model is one, what would we actually see in the evidence? If the classical model is right, what would we actually see? And understanding that maybe the Keynesian model didn't apply in the 80s and 1990s, but maybe the Keynesian model applies now. So that doesn't mean that we reject the classical model or the rational forward-looking model for eternity. Just means that right now that may not be the right one to apply. And interestingly, even some of the most thoughtful members of the economics profession, and I give a quote here from Paul Romer, who certainly has criticized, has been a critic of macroeconomics, as an interesting piece on mathiness. And even him, when he was sort of commenting on this debate, he said that basically, I'm quoting it, as scientists, we have to hold ourselves to a standard that requires us to reach a consensus about which model is right. But I think that's precisely, unproductive, because the right model is different in different settings. And instead, what we need to be doing is focusing much more on figuring out, developing our toolkit for understanding in real time which model applies best. So I think if we had, this kind of a more alternative view, recognizing that economics is a portfolio of models, it would force us to think harder about model selection in real time rather than to doctrinaire debates about, which model is universally correct. It would also make us a lot more humble about how much we really understand, given the diversity of models that we have to work with and the diversity of circumstances. I think it would make us better analysts of social phenomena. I think it would help close some of the gaps with other traditions of social sciences, because we often are viewed as being too wedded to particular models. In fact, I think the richness and diversity of economics is, I think, something that is not sufficiently understood outside of mainstream neoclassical economics. And that's partly, as I've argued here, is our fault, is the way that we present ourselves in the public. So I think ultimately we might have made a much more fruitful contribution to the public debate. So let me just stop here. It is a kind of sort of like a anticlimactic conclusion that it's not that we're financially in the pockets of special interest and that there is some very deep structural problem in economics. That a lot of it is really about how we carry ourselves in public and how we actually think about our own methodology. So it's really part of it. It's solving our own internal problems, is doing the housekeeping as well, and as are thinking about our social responsibility. So I hope some of this has made sense. I've gone over my time, and let me just stop here. And I hope you're still with me at this point.
Dani, I know it's late. Would you have time for a few questions before, if we can figure out a way to get them to you before we say goodbye?
Sure.
Okay, great. If people want to ask questions, I think they're going to have to come up here, take this microphone, ask the question near Dani so he can actually hear you. So do you want to come up and start us off? And let us know if you can hear Dani.
Uh,
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Is that on?
Okay.
Okay, good. If you stand right here, he'll hear you.
Okay.
Dani, can you hear us?
Hear us?
Dani, can you hear us?
Very faintly, I'm afraid.
Okay. Why don't you sit down here? Dani, give me 1 second here. We're going to do something and get this going, and we'll have just a few questions. Can you just give me 1 second? I'll get this going for you. Can you see us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so here's your questioner. Go ahead.
Hi, Dani. I'm Mona Ali from the State University of New York at New Paltz, and I'm a heterodox economist trained at the New School. And at the New School, I don't know if you're familiar with our particular various schools of thought rooted in Marxian political economy, post-Keynesian economy as well. We really challenge conventional economic models rooted in Ricardian comparative advantage. And while I really love the complexity of the arguments you laid out today, and I agree that we need more pluralism within economics rather than a sort of a didactism, I wonder about this in various instances where I've seen economists like you, and I'm thinking of Piketty, for example, again, speaking to a heterodox audience, I'm wondering why there's so little back and forth between mainstream economists like yourself, who do embrace pluralism, and economists like Piketty as well, working on income distribution, also embraces pluralism. In a sense, that pluralism does not really inflect their theoretical models. So, work that's been done by folks like Anwar Sheikh on absolute advantage and a real serious critique of comparative advantage never really enters into the discourse of mainstream economists working on international trade and finance. And I really think, and I wonder about that lack of diversity within that bulwark of the mainstream. You in the earlier part of your presentation, you explained very clearly why comparative advantage or the gains from trade are one of the central tenets of economic theory. 90% of economists agree that, that there's consensus about the gains from trade. But there is another school of thought rooted in a criticism of Ricardo that challenges the view, but is never really seriously considered by mainstream trade economists. That there might be a theoretical lacuna. In fact, there might be, a different way of thinking about trade. From Anwar Sheikh's perspective, trade is clearly produces winners and losers, and it's right there in the theory, if one thinks about it from an absolute advantage rather than a comparative advantage Ricardian story. And so I worry about that, about kind of this hegemonic, I'm running out of time. All right.
Dani, we have 3 people lined up for questions. I'm going to let you hear from each of them, and then you'll have the concluding word. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Dani. My name is John Kamlos from the University of Munich, retired. Really appreciate your doing this. I'd like to mention that the gains are measured in monetary terms, generally speaking. And in utility, it may come out to be very different. So gains in dollar terms may not turn out to be gains in utility terms. I'll give you one example quickly. There's $1 million gain, but it goes to one person, let's say the Walton sisters, okay? And 30 people lose $30,000 as a consequence of losing their jobs. What do you think the outcome would be in terms of utility? Okay, Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Rodrik. My name is Monica Sheldon-London. I'm unaffiliated. I'm the CEO of Alpha FTS. And I was invited to submit my paper to the 38th Middle East Economics Association section this morning. I hate to sound like I'm repeating my colleague who just spoke, but as you're talking about applying the economic model to the circumstances in the real world, and the settings really should actually sort of assist us in directing what is the correct and appropriate economic model. What I have discovered is that, let's just say in agriculture, you bring in $1 billion, but you create $1 trillion in damage by overpumping the aquifer. I mean, it's kind of the same concept, and I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you all for the questions, and I think there's sort of variations on I think on a theme which is consistent with my argument. Now, I think all of you have raised problems with the standard Ricardian model, and I wish I had more time to engage in a lengthier discussion with each one of you, but I would say that each one of these refinements or caveats of taking the model in a more realistic direction are things that are accommodated in what we teach. So, for example, the distributional implications, the fact that that you might have some people gaining a lot and other who might already be very rich, and therefore in terms of social utility or any kind of social welfare function, that social utility may not necessarily increase. That's in the very nature of what we teach in the standard Ricardian model. Of course, that doesn't happen because there's only one factor of production, labor, and all of labor gains. But that's very very specific to the Ricardian model. And the moment that you move away from the Ricardian model, you have all these, the gamut of very stark distributional implications that you don't even need to talk about utilities. Even when you're talking about monetary terms, there are lots of people who are going to lose. How can you trade off gainers versus losers? And as economists, we just sweep this under the rug, and we just assume compensation. But of course, we don't know. We know that compensation doesn't occur. So the honest thing for us to say is that since compensation isn't happening, as economists, we cannot necessarily pass a social welfare judgment in situations where there are very stark distributional implications. And I wish we had been much more honest about that, rather than simply saying that, yes, free trade is good, in the long run everything will work out, and blah, blah, without any kind of empirical backing for making such statements. So I think that's what I'm arguing for, how we could have been more useful. Now that's on distributional issues. Now, I think the first and the third questions also had to do with, I think, issues about failings of the Ricardian model because of the possibility of particular market failures. So second, in the third, with respect to the third comment, it was really about an environmental problem and an environmental sort of degradation that is not appropriately taken care of. And then, yes, we have actually, not only models, but we actually have empirical evidence where, in fact, trade could make you worse off if it leads you to expand, let's say, cutting down of forests in environments where, in fact, not property rights are not provided, and these common property resources, there's already an overgrazing or overcutting problem, and therefore you make it worse by trading more. So I think, again, this is what I want to say is that this is not something that is completely alien to what it is that we teach in the seminar room. And I think our problem is that we have not been able to take these on board fully, and therefore we're perceived as if these are things that we don't talk about. And with respect to the sort of the more heterodox approaches, again, I'm sorry I didn't get the name of the first questioner. I wish we could have exchanged more. So I think what she had in mind is kind of a more dynamic setting where you might have distributional effects not just within countries, but also distributional effects across countries. Some countries might end up being worse off as a whole. And that also, again, sort of depends on the presence of various kinds of externalities, market failures, increasing returns to scale effects, coordination failures. And I teach that all the time, and I rely more on the neoclassical literature when I teach that. But I think and that's partly because that's more what I know. But I think it is there, and we should have been a lot more upfront about this being part of what it is that we actually do. And I think so. I don't think the debate between the neoclassicals and the heterodox or the should be on whether trade under certain circumstances can generate negative effects or not. It should be on trying to understand better what those circumstances are, because certainly in neoclassical economics there are a lot of discussion, a lot of frameworks and models on that as well. So I think I'm sorry I'm not there. I wish we could have talk about this at greater length, and I could understand what specific issues are that each questioner had. And in the absence of that, I have to apologize. That's the best I can do.
We've just invited 500 emails. So please, Dani, thank you. Professor Rodrik, thank you so much for sticking with us all day today and joining us in this way, which I know wasn't ideal for you, but we just really appreciated your kicking off our sessions. So please join me in thanking Professor Rodrik.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And
thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You be well. Bye-bye.